Good evening and welcome. Sorry that we're getting started a few minutes late. My name is Patty Salkin, and I'm the dean here at Touro Law Center, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the 4th Annual Howard Glickstein Lecture on Civil Rights and Public Policy. And so before I introduce Dean Glickstein to introduce our speaker, for our guest this evening, I wanted to share a little bit of Dean Glickstein's background with you. So although he started his career in labor law at a New York City law firm, I think he left there to quickly find his passion at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, where he worked in the Research and Appeals section. And it was at that time that he had a hand in helping to draft the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He also became the general counsel and later staff director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He later served as the director of the Notre Dame Center for Civil Rights, and he was a professor and director of the Equal Employment Litigation Clinic at Howard University School of Law. He was the dean of Bridgeport Law School, and then he joined the family here at Touro Law School in 1986, where he served as dean until 2004. And I think during his tenure as the dean at Touro, he really helped to instill a culture of social justice, community service, and made sure and continues to make sure that our students, that our faculty, our staff, our alumni are reminded on a regular basis of the responsibility that we all have to ensure civil rights and social justice for all. And so it has been an enormous honor for me to join the Touro Law family and to get to work with such wonderful people like Howard Glickstein. So it was my pleasure to introduce him to you this evening, and Dean Glickstein is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Patty. One of my significant accomplishments that you didn't mention was that I was on the Dean Search Committee that selected you. So, this is the 4th Civil Rights and Public Policy lecture that we've held, and I'm so pleased to see so many people here tonight. I think I appreciate very much that the law school has sponsored this lecture, and we do it every year. Over the years, I have been involved with many civil rights and public interest organizations. Few have been as focused and as effective as Erase Racism. Erase Racism is an 11-year-old Long Island nonprofit organization. Might be 12 years now. Is it 12 or 11? It's 12. Elaine Gross's husband shakes his head. He knows. He knows what every one of those years meant. It's a 12-year-old organization dedicated to eliminating racial disparities and promoting racial equity in the areas of housing, community development, public education, and health. Elaine Gross, our speaker tonight, is the president of Erase Racism. There are not many people as qualified as Elaine to deliver a lecture on civil rights and public policy. As co-chair of Erase Racism, I have the honor of working with Elaine. An early project was to study the deficiencies in the Nassau and Suffolk counties' fair housing laws, and there were many. After preparing a report documenting those deficiencies, Elaine led an effort to rewrite the housing laws of Nassau and Suffolk County and successfully lobbied the Nassau and Suffolk legislatures to pass the new laws. I cannot think of many instances where laws have been revised so rapidly. Now, Elaine does not have a large staff, right? She's always telling us that, maybe she should be more economical, but I think a staff of 2, maybe with a few people assisting occasionally. She works with a very small staff and must take the lead in promoting programs, raising money, conceiving new initiatives, and interacting with a variety of government, business, and nonprofit leaders. Elaine has become an influential leader on Long Island in very short order. She is quoted in the newspapers and is on TV almost weekly. She recently was appointed by Governor Cuomo as a member of the Long Island Regional Development Council. She also has served on the Long Island Regional Planning Council. Elaine does not play the role of a token minority when she is a member of such organizations. She is outspoken and not hesitant at all about challenging established policies and beliefs. She gets a particular pleasure out of making people uncomfortable. Elaine advocates from a position of strength. She always is well-grounded in the facts. A depth of knowledge and experience allows her to be both the idea person and the implementer of policy. Some may ask why, after the legislative accomplishments of the last 50 years and the significant court victories, do we still need an organization focused on erasing racism? Former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, who spoke here this morning, said she remembers the time in Suffolk County where there were communities with posted signs that read, "Restricted, no Jews allowed." To be sure, the days of such blatant forms of discrimination are largely behind us. We must look at problems of inequity today through different lenses. Elaine has been the provider of the special lenses we need today to identify the racial inequities that continue to exist. I am sure this evening she will demonstrate what can be seen through those lenses. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Elaine Gross, the president of Erase Racism.
I am certainly honored to be here this evening to deliver this lecture, especially in the presence of one of our civil rights leaders, Howard Glickstein. Howard has a strong moral core. He puts his values into action, and he has the sort of strategic acumen to be effective in what he does. People need only look at this wonderful institution that came about because of Howard's vision and hard work. And as has been stated in the introduction, of course, Howard has made wonderful contributions to civil rights over the years. I am very grateful for Howard and for the Howards, many other people like him, who actually transformed the lives of Southern blacks, for sure, and really all African Americans in the U.S., and beyond that, gave new meaning to the idea of freedom and democracy and justice in the United States. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s laid the groundwork for the foundation for many subsequent struggles for equality. So that said, now comes the bad news. And we have a lot of bad news, so I'm just going to share a few observations with you. I'm here tonight to say that race still matters, even though what you hear in the media, and what people tell me to my face so frequently is, well, Elaine, you've gotten an African-American president. What more do you want? Clearly, there aren't any more problems left around discrimination or around racism, etc. I wish that were true, but it's not. Promoting civil rights for African Americans and Latinos in particular now is a heavy lift for us. And let me just share a few observations about that. I'll start with ballot initiatives. You know about those? Prohibiting the use of affirmative action in public employment, contracting, and public education. And then, of course, if I'm talking about bad news, I have to include our Supreme Court. They've been rolling back affirmative action in employment, striking down voluntary public school desegregation efforts, limiting college and graduate school admissions policies designed to promote racial diversity. And there have been challenges to the Voting Rights Act, of course, which Howard helped to pin. So those were efforts that tried to address the structural impediments to racial equity. And if you were to try in 2013 to push for some efforts, some policies, public policies that would address structural impediments to racial equity, you'd have to consider Congress, the composition of Congress, the composition of the Supreme Court. When you have people like Justices Roberts, Scalia, Alito, Thomas, basically saying that the government may not use race for purposes of inclusion, it becomes pretty disappointing, pretty mind-blowing to consider what you might do. But I am not a pessimist, and so I do have some other things to share in addition to the bad news. The next thing I share is a combination good news, bad news story, and you'll hear why in a minute. We civil rights activists were reduced to cheering the temporary judicial reprieves of the implementation of new voter ID laws. You remember those in 2012. They were designed to suppress the vote of people who generally vote Democratic. They were targeting African Americans, certainly. As Attorney General Eric Holder said at his remarks to the NAACP last year, nationally, only 8% of the white voting age citizens, while 25% of the African American voting age citizens lack a government-issued photo ID. We're not talking about some little small efforts. There were 25 laws, a couple of executive orders, really trying to suppress the black vote. And even though some of the Republican leadership in Washington denied that it was an effort to suppress the vote, you can count on the other folks to actually publicly say, oh, yes, that's what we were trying to do. There was in Pennsylvania, I believe, admitted to the idea that pressing for passage of the state's voter ID laws was to ensure a Romney victory in November 2012. So it's bad news that that is happening. It's certainly good news that a large variety of civil rights litigators went to work to try to block those laws or to defang those laws to some extent. So 11 were made less, either were blocked temporarily or were made less egregious. So that's good news, that there were groups like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the NAACP and many others to do that work. But it's bad news that we were reduced to cheering these outcomes of these few cases, these few decisions, that were slowing the pace of retreat, essentially. Retreat from the march that took place during the 1950s and 60s, bringing about greater racial equity in this country. So what's wrong? At the height of the civil rights movement, blacks and whites, Jews and Christians, and in fact a number of U.S. citizens embraced the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation, at least in southern states. And for many, it was a moral cause, and they also felt that it was not just impacting African Americans, but that we as Americans, as a country, needed to address this issue of segregation. It was embarrassing that internationally people were pointing fingers at us as we talked about being the, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. That's not the picture that Americans see for themselves. We think of ourselves as being the superior ones, the exceptional ones. And it's interesting that those who actually speak the loudest about U.S. exceptionalism are the ones who are trying to dismantle government, the same government that offered the kinds of protections, economic, social, political rights that make people from all over the world admire the United States. That's not to say that we don't have our haters. We clearly do. But I think there are a lot of people who genuinely say, gee, it's really quite something what they've managed to do over there in the U.S. And so this picture of us with the what was happening on the nightly news did not sit well. So there were a number of reasons why people felt at the time that something had to be done about segregation, the Jim Crow segregation in the United States. Fast forward to 2012. The most visible progress advancing equal rights for minority groups in 2012 were focused on gay rights rather than equal access to opportunity for blacks and Latinos. And let me be clear, even though I was critical of where we were with the voter ID laws, that we were having to cheer or slow down retreat, I in no way want to imply that we should not applaud loudly for those efforts. And I also am applauding very loudly for the successful efforts around increasing civil rights in the fight against the, for marriage equality, including our own New York law that was passed last year. Like Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm not a pessimist. I believe the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So I'm going to offer some observations comparing the civil rights of the 1950s and 60s and the LGBT fight for marriage equality now. This is not at all a kind of comprehensive analysis. You all don't want to be here at 10 o'clock, I know. But I have a couple of observations about how the politics of deserving and undeserving play a role in the civil rights progress that we see happening today. I believe it was much easier for people like Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders during that time to make a direct connection between the oppression of slavery and the vestige of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. And along with that came the narrative, of course, that Negroes were being oppressed because it was appropriate to oppress them, it was good to keep them in their place and all of that. And the television was very helpful in producing another narrative which said that these Negroes are not asking for much, they're church-going, they're good people, they just want to be treated like human beings, yet they're suffering under the sort of cruelty of police and other establishment figures that are operating within a legal structure that was blatantly immoral. But even with that narrative, I'm sure if you heard that narrative today, everybody in this room would raise their hand to say they are absolutely deserving. But even with that narrative, remember, there was not a sort of universal outcry to rampant lynchings. Between 1882 and 1964, 3,445 African Americans were lynched, mostly in the South. Whites were occasionally lynched too, although less frequently once Jim Crow segregation took hold. So we have to see that backdrop. Yes, there was this narrative. Yes, people responded to it. No, they didn't respond overnight. No, they didn't stand up the way they should have against the most egregious form. And the northern liberals, white liberals, saw themselves different from the southern segregationists. The southern segregationists were so egregious in their behavior that many people finally sympathized with the Negroes at that time and really felt that they needed to support their cause. And thankfully, they were urged on by many of the religious leaders, Christians and Jews, who encouraged their congregation to support the effort as well. But keep in mind that the Jim Crow segregation was bad because it was intentional in the eyes of northern folks. There was a different opinion about northern discrimination and northern segregation, and the response to that would often be a charitable response in terms of helping those that are less fortunate, but not the demand for structural changes that people were finally willing to make around Jim Crow segregation. So once again, the television helped us out because it showed that brutality that was going on in the South. It showed the fire hoses and the dogs, et cetera. And so those structural impediments that intentionally denied Southern blacks access to numerous opportunities were obvious to anyone willing to look. The northern version of discrimination was less obvious, and structures were not as well seen. And you're going to hear a little bit more about how that played out in a minute. So what's the narrative that we have today? The first point I would make is that far too many people reject the argument that the disparities that we see between whites and blacks and whites and Latinos are in fact structural impediments. What they would rather say is that blacks prefer to live only with other blacks, even though at Erase Racism, we contracted with the Stony Brook Survey Research Center, and in fact, that's not the way blacks answered. Overwhelmingly, blacks responded that they prefer communities that are racially integrated. And in fact, 69% of them said they like a 50-50. That would be their ideal. If asked about what would be their ideal community. Instead of looking for structural impediments, people prefer to say, well, it just so happens that whites and blacks and Latinos aren't in the same school districts. It's not that we are trying intentionally to discriminate against them, but it just so happens they're in the different school districts. Well, the fact is we have 124 school districts that are racially segregated. It didn't happen by accident. And we know, just as we knew with the voter ID laws that were being put forth, we know what happens from that structural setup. It's not surprising if you have housing discrimination, you have housing segregation, you have school districts that mirror that segregation. It's not surprising that you also have public schools that are racially segregated. We prefer not to see structural impediments when a town that is almost 90% white builds affordable housing and then says that that housing is for people who already live in the town. Apparently, for the Supreme Court justices, disparate impact is too complex a concept. But anyone with some level of common sense could kind of figure out that if the community is almost 100% white, guess who is not going to have access to that housing if the housing is for people who already live there. So it becomes convenient for us in the North to think that we are not like our friends in the South. And yet, in the South, they did, kicking and screaming, but they did manage to integrate their schools. It's resegregating now, but we like to pat ourselves on the back to say that we're not like those other people. And yet, we have levels of racial segregation here on Long Island. It's not good being 10th in the nation, but we are the 10th most racially segregated community in the country, metro region. So the first point is that Blacks and Latinos are not seen as deserving now because there is an impression that somehow, whatever the discrepancies are, the disparities are, it has to do with them. It can't possibly have to do with anything else, anything that's structural. If you look at the news, Blacks and Latinos are responsible for their own fate. Supposedly they don't want to work. They choose to live in communities that have high crime rates, et cetera. That's the lie that is perpetuated. And if there is something on the news about race, it's about crimes, gang violence, et cetera. Latinos, because they are, quote, illegal in the U.S., that blocks really a lot of serious conversation about civil rights for Hispanics. You may remember the Show Me Your Papers statutes, which basically, especially in Arizona and Alabama, opened the doors for law enforcement personnel to demand identification of Hispanic-looking individuals walking in the wrong place at the wrong time. Missing almost completely from these news stories are the historical context that would allow people to see the structural problems. Which brings me to my third point. Another common refrain is that the problem is really economic. It's not about race, it's all about money. On Long Island, we are actually more segregated by race than by income, which, unless you've done the research looking at the American Communities Survey data, which my staff person, Olivia Ildefonso, has done, you don't realize that we're more segregated by race than by income. And even the New York Times that really had some good articles talking about the how the income inequality was going to have a horrible impact on our economic recovery. Somehow they managed to do that and not talk about race, not talk about the intersectionality between race and poverty. And the presidential candidates in 2012 also managed to have 3 debates and somehow not talk about the increasing racial isolation that can be found in most of the metropolitan areas, including the suburbs. So there are a lot of people who are putting their, what do you call it? Putting your head under the stone or whatever. Putting their head in the sand. Putting their head in the sand. Not wanting to actually deal with some of these stark realities that we have here today. Apparently the sound bites that we like to have in the news, it's just too complicated to talk about disparate impact, to talk about the need for being very intentional in our fair housing policies, to make sure that they are in fact implemented. The fact that post-Brown versus Board of Education, we still have public school segregation. It's inter-district segregation rather than intra-district. But it's segregation nonetheless, with the same kinds of horrible results. And it's easier for Long Island to talk about that income segregation in general rather than the racial segregation. The standard narrative about what's happening in our public schools, for example, explains that, or purports to explain, that the students either aren't smart or don't work hard enough, and that the parents don't care about education. And that's another one of those stories that people seem to enjoy telling me to my face. I'm really kind of amazed by it. Howard mentioned I sat on the Long Island Regional Planning Council, and at one of our public meetings, someone who worked for Suffolk County at the time came up and gave a long tirade about how there was no problem with racial segregation, and you know, Elaine, how those families really don't care about their children anymore. And you know, I won't bore you with what I said to him after the meeting, but you know, needless to say, on the face of it, you think that these statements are so ignorant that nobody would make them. But I have to tell you that that is not the case. Maybe nobody in this room would make them, but I want you to be aware that, in fact, that's how people feel. And that keeps people from actually taking action. Because if it's somebody else's problem, if it's really those students' problems, and I've met so many brilliant African American and Latino students in a lot of different districts. And last year, with our essay contest, and I wasn't a judge, we had other people who were the judges, they chose an African American boy from Roosevelt, whose essay was fantastic, and it's still on our website, I think, his essay. So, you know, I just think that we need to have a very honest conversation on Long Island about the continuation of structural impediments to racial equity. And there is a different narrative, and I said I was going to give you just a little touch of a comparison. There's a totally different narrative around gay rights. clearly there were a kind of confluence of political and other reasons why the marriage equality law was passed. But there was a narrative that helped over time, not from the beginning, but more recently, to say that gays, lesbians were deserving. We know that historically they were not deserving, right? They were the other. They were not normal, fundamentally different from so-called normal Americans that were the heterosexuals. And folks did not sympathize. But my observation is that in recent years, some prominent and important heterosexuals embraced the idea that gays were not really outsiders, that in fact they could be a member of your own extended family, that they were sons and daughters of powerful Wall Street tycoons, a former vice president, and now even a U.S. senator. Many of the proponents of same-sex marriage are successful financially, and most importantly, the gays and lesbians among those prominent and important heterosexuals are white. Now, what I've given you is a stereotype because there is plenty of evidence that there are gays that are struggling, and certainly when you talk about the denial of certain kinds of benefits that until the Defense of Marriage Act is struck down, you won't be getting any federal benefits. So it's clear that there are reasons why people could be struggling financially. But remember, I'm talking about the narrative, and the narrative doesn't have to be true. It just has to take hold and sound good, and you can use it to your advantage. And not everybody in the South was an angel. Not all of those Negroes went to church, even though church-going was very popular in the South. Much more, it's sort of like if you didn't go to church, there could be something very seriously wrong with you. But all of those narratives are composites, right? And what I think is that the narrative that took hold finally allowed gays to be seen as part of the larger family. And of course, they should be allowed to marry who they wish. And more importantly, what is it going to take away from you? There are no calls for redistributing income or changing school district lines or any of those things that the racial equity civil rights efforts require. And in fact, there was the Independent Economic Conference had projected that same-sex unions would generate $284 million in additional wedding revenue and tourism, and put another $27 million in taxes and license fees into New York State's coffers. And I'm sure that for some people, that was a good argument. You know, they thought, oh, okay, well then that's okay, they can get married. Bloomberg reported last year that in fact for New York City, they calculated that same-sex marriages had generated an estimated $259 million in economic impact and $16 million in city revenues. So you see where I'm going here. It is in the world of deserving and undeserving. I think the tide changed sufficiently enough to begin to tip the balance a bit for gays and lesbians. The fight is not over, And we know that there is a kind of a steady drumbeat coming out of the many of the conservative Christians, and not just conservative Christians, I'm reminded recently, that there is, people have said the fight is not over. So folks aren't rolling over on this, even with the success in some states for these new provisions. So I said that my this analysis was certainly not comprehensive, and it's oversimplified for the purposes of time. But nonetheless, I do think the point is made that when you're talking about questions of access to opportunity and self-determination and the right not to be discriminated against for blacks and Latinos, it remains a heavy, heavy lift in today's climate. And fundamentally, they are seen as undeserving. And that anything to try to assist in changing the skew that we currently have is being turned around to say that we're giving special privileges. We're giving special treatment to those who are really not deserving of it, which is really the sort of the ideology of the reverse discrimination cases that we're hearing about. So the idea that racism is by and large a thing of the past, I'm sure, I know that from the polling that a lot of people believe that. Clearly 58% of the African Americans don't believe that, according to a survey that was in Harper's Magazine. 58% disagreed with that statement that racism is by and large a thing of the past. Only 34% of the whites and 32% of the Hispanics disagreed with that statement. Which brings me to close to my final point that I want to make, is not only that race matters, but color matters. Internationally, I was contacted recently by a couple of different people talking about colorism in other countries. And I won't speak to that. I'm not an expert on it. But what they were essentially saying is, you know, in our country, we're all the same ethnic group, or people think of us as being the same ethnic group, but in fact, we look different in terms of our gradations of color. And they were basically saying to me, Elaine, we have the same problem that you guys have over here. You know, don't think it is unique to your history. And, you know, of course, our history produces particular sort of absurdity in its narrative. But what I'm hearing now more and more is that this colorism is more of a universal problem. And I would say that although some white Hispanics have been able to enjoy the advantages of being white, that skin color of black and brown Hispanics in particular prevents them from being included within the feeling of that family. You know what I was talking about, that narrative? These are people that are really just like you. They could be part of your family. That narrative doesn't work for us. So we're going to have to find another narrative. And I don't have one to offer tonight. But I'm only saying that the reality is hoping that people will act with their hearts is not enough. We know that it's much more complicated than that. They act with their pocketbooks. They act with their self-interest. You know, I thought it was interesting that this most recent gentleman who said that was it his daughter or his son? I think his daughter was a lesbian, and and after going along with the homophobia, meaning not speaking out against it, suddenly after the election he says, "Oh, I'm for it." You know, it's really a sad commentary that you can't be for it until after the election. You can't be supportive of it with your daughter. And you can't be supportive of it because of all these other people out there who want to get married. But because your daughter is a lesbian, then, okay, I can be supportive now. So we have a big challenge ahead of us to figure out a way to recapture the level of concern and awareness and support for completing the task that was not completed. We made great strides during the 1950s and 1960s. But if you look at the public school education on Long Island, if you see that 65% of the black and 61% of the Hispanic children, according to the New York State Department of Education, attend the lowest performing schools as compared to 13% of the white school students and 10% of the Asian students. No student should attend the lowest performing school. We shouldn't have any. But clearly that gap is not acceptable. 65% for black and 61% for Latino versus 13 for white and 10 for Asian. That gap is not acceptable in 2013. And I think that that's clearly one of the reasons why Erase Racism has really prioritized for 2013 dealing with the public school education issue here on Long Island. And we have partners. This will not happen. It will not happen overnight, and it won't happen just because we said so. It will happen because people come together to work on that. But there really is a different kind of challenge, I think, a more difficult challenge that we face today in this very complex society that we live in, to find a way to bring together a very diverse constituency to advocate for these kinds of changes here. I believe that lawyers have played a pivotal role throughout the civil rights movement, and certainly they continue to play a pivotal role. And so I am particularly pleased to be here at Touro this evening, and that there are students here, I'm guessing from the ages, that there are students here, and I hope that some of you will be going into public interest law. We have our work cut out for us. Bayard Rustin was one of the civil rights leaders who talked about the transition from protest to political power. And he cautioned that by destroying Jim Crow, we would not, in fact, gain equality. He suggested that the post-Jim Crow era would be even more challenging than the legal battles under Jim Crow. And I believe that that was a profound analysis at that time, especially when I look now to see the extent to which structural racism is not appreciated now, is not recognized now. So I conclude my remarks with a hope and a challenge to everyone who is here. I think that we can do this. We can, in fact, re-energize a movement for racial equity. We can do it on Long Island, and we can do it today. It will not be easy, but I hope that everyone will find a way to join in that fight. And I mention Erase Racism not as a personal plug, but really as a way of saying to everyone, find your place. Find what will work for you, how you can work with others. And here is the specific charge. Please remember that structural change is needed, not just charity. Remember to look at the racial impact, the racial disparities, the racial outcomes from policies, practices, and behaviors, not just whether someone intends to discriminate or whether some policy is intended to produce disparities and disproportionalities or block access to opportunities or create or maintain separate institutions. If you remember this charge, then I'm sure that you will do something to advance the civil rights movement. I will, hit the road, Jack. I will end with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from the remarks that he gave on December 5th, 1955, at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And to set the stage, this was a mass meeting with about 3,000 or 4,000 people in attendance, and they were going to act on the resolutions to continue the Montgomery boycott. On December 1st, Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to get up from her seat. And I recognize that this is a very different situation. There are not 3,000 or 4,000 of us here. But here are Dr. King's words. I think they are appropriate. We are here this evening for serious business. We are here in a general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens and we are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its means. We are here because of our love for democracy, because of our deep-seated belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the greatest form of government on earth. Good evening and thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, for that inspiring and challenging talk.